at Kiwanis Park on July 28th. So of course, as always, the public is welcome. We look forward to a full event as well. And then just to reiterate, at our clinics now, contracting with AMI a lot of the time, they are offering vaccinations for 6 months plus. So we know that back to school is also driving people interested in families and vaccinations. As always, we have our donation of teddy bears, community resources that will be on site, school supplies, ice cream, and more. Then we also are looking at Sunday, August 28th. I think that's exactly a month from the Kiwanis Park New Monk Professionals. So we have the back to school block party that is taking place. That's 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Again, a number of community resources will be on site, along with free haircuts and braiding and backpacks for kids. So there's a number of things going on there as well. So just wanted to draw your attention to a couple other things before we go into Sadie's presentation, is that we also are on Facebook and we do have a website. So if you haven't taken a look there, we're trying to keep that as up to date as possible. And then our next meeting is Tuesday, August 9th. So that is going to be more of a group share, where we're asking everyone on the call to share what you have going on with your organizations and discovering those opportunities. So we have been involved with a number of events. I know, Ernesto, you do a great job every month with your interagency meetings, just sharing of ideas. And if there's anywhere where we can help support one another, that is always wonderful to have those discussions and bring community resources together. So I think that is it. I feel like I went through that pretty quickly. Just organizationally, just to update you all on MCI. So I know a number of you have heard just kind of our transition over the past few months. Started as more of still community-based organization. And then we are a 501c3. We do have, I think most of our board members are on this call today. So Dr. Pam and Ernesto and OT, and also Trish from Partnership. So just wanted to make sure everyone is aware who the board members are. So you have that information, and then we continue to apply for funding. We have received some funding to date, and then making sure that that is going back to our grassroots organizations, which is really, really important to us. And if you remember way back when, we talked about that as far as relying on all of our community partners, and we want to make sure that our grassroots organizations are supported. So a lot of the funding is going right back into the grassroots organization. So I just wanted to make sure everyone kind of had a high level of what's going on with MCI as we continue in our work. And like I said, there isn't much of a slowdown. So thank you to everyone for being here today. We always appreciate talking with all of you and the discussion that we have. So Sarah, are you ready to introduce today's presenter?
I am ready to introduce today's presenter, and it is good to see everyone, as I'm sure many of you, like me, are participating in meetings frequently that discuss our housing crisis, specifically affordable housing. So I'm excited and honored to have Sadie DiNatalberta to provide us with an overview of our housing strategy that was recently prepared to help address the region's housing needs. And she's going to summarize the planning process, the key findings and recommendations within the report on behalf of the Fox Cities Greater Outagamie County Housing Strategy. So without further ado, sorry if I butchered your name there, dear Sadie, but please take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to share a PowerPoint. So let me know when you can see my slide.
We can see it, Sadie.
Perfect. All right. A bit bigger.
And
And then, Sadie, just before you begin, I'm sorry, I meant to say it again before we started, if you just hopped on. We are recording this presentation so we can add it to our website. So the folks that were not able to join will have a chance to do that later. And we are still working on getting our earlier July presentation up on our website. So I'll be helping monitor the chat if there are any questions.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me in to share the work that we've been doing over the last few months. Just to, again, recap, my name is Sadie DiNatale-Berta. I'm the principal planner at Outagamie County's Development and Land Services Department. So before we sort of get into what the meat and potatoes of the strategy was, I just wanted to give a little high level overview of why the county and our department decided to develop a housing strategy in the first place. So for starters, in 2020, Outagamie County adopted our comprehensive plan, and that included guiding language and policy that suggested we were going to support affordable housing and diverse housing options for our community. In addition to that, housing has continued to be a growing concern and priority for our community. We keep hearing it, and so we knew we wanted to do something to start addressing those issues. Then, of course, when the pandemic hit, a lot of local governments received allocation of ARPA dollars. And when we were doing initial stakeholder outreach specifically for ARPA, we heard as one of the top 5 priorities that housing was a huge concern. And so we wanted to make sure if we were using these ARPA dollars to support or help address our housing needs, that we were doing so effectively. And we wanted a strategy that outlined actions that had value to our community. Early on, we also decided to make this a regional strategy. One, of course, housing markets operate regionally. So we wanted to make sure we were looking at the bigger picture there. A lot of our developers and our housing service providers work within the regional market, so they don't necessarily stop at our county's political or geographic lines. So we wanted to be inclusive of that work. And we also wanted to make sure that this tool could be used by other folks in the community outside of just Outagamie County, as we compiled a bunch of people who worked in the housing space, and we wanted to make sure that we were taking advantage of that group to the best of our ability. So again, this tool could be used to decision makers for agencies or local governments from across the region. Just a quick note about our process. Because of the way ARPA rules are set up, we needed to make sure that those dollars were going to be allocated by the end of 2024, which means we had a lot of work to do in terms of just identifying what projects or programs we might support through that dollars, as well as implementing that project or program itself. So we actually started this process in January. We first formed a housing advisory task force that comprised planners from different local governments, some private and nonprofit affordable housing developers, as well as those who work in the housing space providing social services. We compiled a number of different data points so that we can start looking at the housing market findings from across the region. So demographics, housing costs, housing market findings such as, what types of units exist in the market today. We met with our housing task force 4 times. The first was really to talk about those market findings, to discuss our housing needs, and to really get a game plan on what were our most pressing problems to solve over the next 10 years. The county compiled a range of best practice approaches to address our housing needs, sort of actions that have been implemented in the state or in other places across the United States. Our housing task force added to those best practice approaches and provided other ideas. So we ultimately had a list of 40 different strategies that we evaluated and considered over the course of our planning process. We ultimately prioritized those. We recommended 19 specific actions, which I'll get into today. And then we started considering loosely what our next steps were after this product had been finalized. So before I get into those 19 actions, I wanted to just touch at a very high level what we were finding in the data and what we were sort of discussing that led us to these recommendations in the first place. So we had 5 really high level findings, and I'll just go over them briefly with you today. The first need that we identified was that our region needs more housing. So that's more units in the market that can be accessed by our community. I won't get into the sort of weeds of this calculation, but we wanted to produce a high-level regional housing target so we would know if we could, if we were meeting our mark in terms of demand versus supply. So of course, that's demand from households who need a unit and supply of those units in the region. So what we learned was that we were actually, as a region, slightly underproducing housing, which can be quite challenging because if you don't have a sufficient amount of supply for units, that market becomes more competitive and price escalations will just continue to increase on those units. We also found that our region is growing in terms of population. So as our population grows, that just means more households competing for those units in the market. So paired with, our existing underproduction and our need for new housing units to accommodate our population growth, we estimated that over the next 10 years, we would need about 11,000 to 18,000 units over that 10-year period. If those new units were developed linearly, it'd be about 1,100 to about 1,800 units per year. And that's, of course, housing units being developed in all of our different communities across the region, from Shiocton to Neenah, New London to Wrightstown, and all in between. So in addition to just a need for more housing, we also identified a growing need for housing that's affordable to households at all income, and especially for those at the lower end of the income spectrum who are currently really struggling. We defined affordable housing as housing that costs 30% or less of a household's income. So on this screen, I just wanted to sort of describe these exhibits for you to sort of show how big our need for affordable housing really is. On the left exhibit, we're showing renter households. Each bar represents a different segment of household income. And on the right, we're showing households with a mortgage, also with the bars separating households by income. What you see are those that are making $34,000 or less are very cost burdened. They're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. Many of them are paying more than half of their income on housing. And when that occurs, they're making really tough decisions about how they can afford their other basic necessities, whether that is childcare, food, medical care, etc. We also identified a need to situate affordable housing, especially new affordable housing developments, in high opportunity areas. That's really looking at the extent to which some of our communities might be inadvertently excluding lower income folks just because they have opposition to affordable housing developments. And some of those stereotypes make it very difficult to put affordable housing in certain communities. We also wanted to make sure that if we were building new affordable housing, that they were located in areas that weren't already impoverished so that we can make sure that there is economic mobility opportunities for those folks who are living there. So just to kind of describe a little bit what these high opportunity areas might look like, it could look like areas where the homeownership is a little bit higher, so there's less turnover in those neighborhoods, perhaps with more job density in proximity to these developments. They could have lower poverty rates, lower crime rates, or in proximity to amenities that people want to live near. So that's schools, parks, trails, transit stops, and things of that nature. We also identified a need for greater housing variety in terms of the products that are actually available in the market. So regionally, we're looking at about 70% of our dwelling units being single-family detached housing. And that's not necessarily bad in and of itself, especially because this housing type is really preferential to a lot of people. However, they can also be inaccessible in terms of being more expensive to produce and having different housing options that could be comparatively more or less costly, or could be very helpful to people trying to access a unit. So thinking about other types of housing such as townhomes, duplexes and triplexes and duplexes and multifamily units could be very advantageous for our market to accommodate. I also wanted to add just this another exhibit to kind of contextualize housing products. I just find this one to be very interesting. What you're seeing is bars that distribute our housing products by the number of bedrooms per it, so essentially housing size. On the left, we have studios and 1 bedrooms, and on the right, that final bar, we have housing units with 4 or more bedroom units. What we see is that most of our larger housing units are primarily entirely owner occupied, which can be very challenging to our renter households who either can't afford a home or do not have the credit to attain a homeownership product. And they might be forced to either compete with the remaining units of those rental units, those orange bars, or they're being forced into situations where they're being overcrowded in smaller units. And then again, on the left side, where we see a 9% share of owner occupied as those studio and 1 bedrooms, that can also be problematic. And I'll just give an example that we have, you know, aging senior population. Many of those folks may be interested in downsizing, still want to be a homeowner, but there's not necessarily those units available in the market at those smaller sizes. We also have a lot of our household sizes shrinking somewhat. And so having some smaller homeownership projects can also be very important for our market. The final high-level finding that we decided was the preservation of our existing housing stock. And we can think about those in 2 veins. One, it's preservation of existing units in terms of rehabilitating units that might have fallen into disrepair, or helping homeowners and folks maintain their property into the future. And we also see preservation in terms of we have a limited amount of housing stock that is dedicated or restricted to people with lower incomes. Sometimes those have expiration dates in terms of 20 to 30 years, in which once we hit that expiration date, they're at risk of converting to market rate. So opportunities and public policy interventions that can really keep those dedicated affordable units for at certain affordability levels can be very important, so we don't lose, you know, the number of those units that we have. All right, after our Housing Advisory Task Force really talked about these issues, and there are others, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the data or findings, I would encourage you to read the strategy, and the Appendix A has most of that data in it. But after discussing these, we ended up with 19 recommendations that we felt would be very helpful to implement over the next 10 years. For organizational purposes, we sort of put those 19 recommendations into one of 5 strategic categories. Although many of these actions are not mutually exclusive to one of these buckets, but it helps from like a messaging and communication standpoint. So theme 1 was our education bucket. Many on our task force recognize that there's a lot of stereotypes and neighborhood opposition concerns that still persist, which makes it very challenging to meet some of our housing needs and begin addressing those systematically. So the 3 actions that we have under this bucket is 1, form a housing alliance, a group that can, you know, include our housing task force, but invite others in so that we can continue to hold ourselves accountable to 1, progress on this housing strategy, but also so that we can continue to work together collectively, agree on messaging that can help us implement individual actions, and also just talk about our issues and our evolving housing needs as a collective. We wanted to establish a housing education program, just materials that we can, you know, give to employers or elected officials or other decision makers that can help explain what our needs are and, you know, maybe how they got to be this way and what opportunities there might be to address them. And then maintaining an inventory of housing services and program was also seen as very important. Some inventories like this might exist, but something that could be, you know, put online in one spot, very specific to the Fox Cities and Greater Outagamie County region, so that everyone from individuals looking for services or existing service providers could have a one-stop shop and where to find this information. Our second theme was to remove regulatory barriers, and that was really specific to policy barriers and zoning code barriers. So we looked at things about increasing allowable residential densities, ensuring there was a sufficient supply of multifamily housing or multifamily land, providing bonus code incentives. Those are things like offering developers a height bonus or a density bonus, or reducing their parking requirements in exchange for them building affordable housing, essentially opportunities that can help them lower their cost and their pro formas so that they can produce more affordable housing units. A lot of these actions in this category would probably need to be implemented at a community by community level because those zoning ordinances have local authority. But they can also be supported by any number of groups in the region. Our third theme was to stabilize households. The two actions we considered here was one, finding a way to offer down payment assistance programs that allows households to build wealth and help them move up the economic ladder. And then sort of for a different segment of our population to make sure we are providing emergency assistance. So those are programs that would help people who are housing insecure or on the cusp of homelessness or are currently experiencing homelessness. Now, these programs like this do exist. So it's not necessarily saying let's start from scratch here, but potentially that means supporting the service providers who provide these so that they can expand their operations or pivot where they need to. The fourth theme was allocate funding. Things that we considered here was offering direct subsidies for new construction, rehabilitation programs, and transitional housing. It also included direct investments in public improvements. So those are infrastructure costs that could help lower developers' overall development budget in exchange for things like building affordable housing or other housing products that meet that community's specific housing needs. This category also included allocating funding to nonprofits and our existing housing providers so that they can expand their operation. Many of them are already doing a lot of good work, but the need is growing. It's outpacing really what they have staffing and funding levels to do, so helping them where they can. And then finally, allocate funding to public housing authorities so that they may add more units to their portfolios. These housing authorities typically are the #1 provider of affordable housing in most communities. So helping them expand their operations is also seen as advantageous. The final theme is using land and properties strategically. So the two actions we recommended here was to the extent that governments and local agencies have surplus public land, that they could be sold at a low cost or at no cost to developers of affordable housing so that they can reduce their land costs and therefore make their projects more affordable. It also included securing vacant or abandoned properties. So those are properties that are at risk of being demolished. They're deteriorating, and in order to keep them in the market functionally, doing things like rehab or revitalization and strategies like that. And then those properties could be sold or rented affordably to those who need it in the region. So over the years, as this strategy is implemented, we hope to accomplish 4 specific outcomes. 1, begin to address the housing needs of our entire community. Those are households of all income levels, those that have supportive service needs, etc. We hope to not just, increase the supply of housing, but also have our housing units create thriving neighborhoods. So that means reducing sprawl, balancing the housing needs of our urban communities versus our rural areas, and making sure that the neighborhoods we create and the communities that we build are inclusive of households of mixed incomes. We want to make sure that we are diversifying our housing stock and expanding our supply. And we particularly highlighted affordable housing, of course, but also of our homeownership products and having those be available to folks across the income spectrum again. And then finally, we hope that this strategy supports policy changes, zoning reform, and planning documents that moves us towards a pro-housing paradigm shift or a pro-housing agenda. Next steps, at least from the county's perspective, we do hope to begin implementing the strategy, and we hope others seek to implement it as well. One thing that we're just focusing on over the next few months is how we can use this strategy to guide decision making on how to allocate our ARPA dollars that we've sort of reserved for housing purposes. We also are interested in collaborating with folks who might be interested in this strategy. And over the next year or so, we'll be working with a group of UW-Madison students to sort of help us create a pilot inventory of that housing service and program repository. So I just want to say thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I also included my email address in case you think of any questions later on. And I've also included the link to our project website, which has our final strategy linked there as well.
Thank you, Sadie, for presenting all of that information. I turn it over to the group for questions and discussion. Who has some questions today?
Sadie, I have a question. You mentioned the nonprofits that you want to support, and I'm assuming those are nonprofits serving Outagamie County. I think of, for example, Levin, that office is in Winnebago County. You know, how do we have those funds allocated to the respective services that can access these funds?
Yeah, so we're actually working with Levin currently. We have a community development block grant, so we're familiar with them, but realistically, how some of these actions might be implemented, of course, we would need to think about what funding streams are available and how they might fit into individual strategies, especially because a lot of funding opportunities, they might have strings attached. They can only be used in particular areas or for particular services or for, you know, specific groups of people. So right now we're looking at the strategy specifically to use with our ARPA dollars. Now, those have a lot of strings attached, but and just looking at those regulations, they're pretty broadly available for housing purposes, so long as they serve low to moderate income households. So right now we'll probably be using the allocate funding category to look at how we might best use those dollars to support housing. And whether it's a nonprofit who might acquire those dollars or a different agency who, you know, wants to make sure that they're serving low to moderate income households, then we would be open to those groups.
Sandy, this is Long Wu from New Hmong Professionals. So you mentioned about Levin's, about new organization like us that want to get into this kind of work. How can we get started and begin to work with you?
Yeah, so for anyone who's interested in this strategy and working to implement it, I would first encourage you to talk with your agency or whoever you are participating with. Find out what action or particular strategy resonates with you, what you might have the time or the resources to dedicate to it, and then start making those connections, whether it be with Outagamie County, another local government, or a service provider you know that is already kind of working in that realm of things, and start having those conversations and bringing people together in that way.
But my question is specific to the county, to you. Who do we work with?
Yeah, so if you're interested in working specifically with the county, I would say feel free to email me or call me offline, and we can talk about what you might specifically be interested in and how we might be able to fit into that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I see Diane has a hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the informative presentation. I can tell a lot of time went into the construction of it, but I have some questions about who you had a large list of recommendations for changing of rules and regulations in order to promote more affordable housing. I was wondering who you collaborated with to come up with that list. And if similar modifications had been made in other regions, what was the outcome of that? Was it successful results, or is this sort of a first time to see how it works?
Yeah, so I put on the screen just who participated on that housing advisory task force. So you can kind of see we had individuals specifically from cities and towns and villages. We had the Home Builders Association, the Realtors Association, different nonprofits and funders, United Way of the Fox Cities, etc. You can look at that list there. But in terms of your question of how has those, potentially like regulatory reform strategies been implemented, a lot of our communities, and these are, I'm talking about like public sector communities who have authority over their own zoning codes, have already started implementing or looking at potential changes, whether that be just starting off at the code audit stage to trying to permit different types of units, such as accessory dwelling units and other types of housing into their permitted uses charts. So I don't have all of the necessary information of that because we just have authority over pretty much the unincorporated area of the county. However, most of the strategies that were recommended have been implemented across the state, across the country. They're really those best practice approaches. Now, to the extent that they're successful, really is a case-by-case basis on the different communities. Some communities will implement one policy change and it will be entirely successful. And in others, they would do the same thing and have, various levels of success. Thinking about, I mentioned accessory dwelling units. So allowing those in your market to be built won't necessarily mean that property owners and developers are going to do that. So you really have to look at those on a case-by-case basis and evaluate it from that standpoint.
Are there any potential costs or drawbacks to these regulation changes that we couldn't anticipate?
Yeah, I would say for every one of our actions, there would be a number of pros and cons to evaluate. And one of the things that this strategy didn't really get into was the evaluation or implementation considerations of any one action. This is really just a step one in the process. As these individual actions get implemented, there's a number of other considerations and questions to address. And the sort of the process of doing that, we might find that some of these actions don't truly have merit or might not work at this time. So really that's, I would say, a step two. Those questions need to be answered, but they weren't necessarily within the scope of this project.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sadie. And then I see Tammy McLaughlin has a question as well.
Hi, Sadie. This is great information. I really appreciate all of your work. And I'm just curious, did you notice trends? Pardon? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was interrupted. Did you notice any trends when you were doing your research of like individuals buying up houses for investment purposes, to be used as landlord or Airbnbs or those types of things? And was there any discussion around that?
Yeah, we didn't gather any data specifically to answer that question. Now we hear that buying up properties for investment purposes, as well as the short-term rental phenomenon, are growing concerns, across the country. We didn't necessarily evaluate those two questions. We primarily looked at supply and demand considerations for the region. So if those issues were apparent, we would start seeing issues with our supply for available housing that's vacant and ready to be purchased or rented on the market. We did see supply constraints in terms of our housing vacancy rate. Our region is sitting at 4%. A healthy housing market is assumed to have a vacancy rate of 5 to 7%. Our national average is closer to 10%. So those concerns, if we were to evaluate them further, we would ask the questions, well, why have we been underproducing housing? One, it could be we're not, they're just being eaten up by short-term rentals or Airbnbs, et cetera. Or two, maybe there is issues that we need to solve in terms of, our developers can't find buildable land, or they can't produce enough because of workforce shortages, etc.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Pam?
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, Sadie. Thanks for the information that you provided. I have a quick question for you. I know that through this, you've, uncovered a lot of different things, and then you have some goals and objectives of what you want to do as you continue on this path. So first question is the Housing Advisory Task Force, are they going to be split into committees to look at this and, in specific areas? And is that how you're going to proceed forward, so that if we have partners who are interested in different aspects of this, we refer them to a committee versus all to you all the time? You know what I'm saying, Sadie? Just so that there's manageability and they're able to get their questions answered, or they're able to communicate with the committees that's going to be most effective in getting the information that they have, or to answer the questions that they have. Is that what you're planning on doing, or is that not determined yet? Are you still trying to figure out how you're going to kind of structure this going forward, and then also building in metrics and accountability in terms of reporting back to the community your accomplishments or your challenges, and all those different pieces?
So yes to both, really. So we're in this sort of phase where we've just completed this strategy. We have some high level considerations of how it might get implemented, in which forming working groups for a specific action was recommended. Now, in terms of at our last Housing Task Force meeting, we sort of ended it by saying we needed to do two things. One, we needed to sort of get the word out about the strategy in and of itself. And some of the folks on our task force volunteered to put together a housing forum in which the entire community would be invited in to talk about, the findings and how we might begin to implement the strategy. And then two, in terms of one of the actual recommended actions, which was form a housing alliance, that goal was to sort of be that initial structure to say, okay, let's get together who wants to be involved in what, how can we report out to each other through this housing alliance, and who wants to be involved in terms of take a leadership role or just take a support role and provide resources or information, or just help how they can. So the county has offered to pilot the first maybe 3 or 4 housing alliance meetings to sort of get that up off the ground. Sort of provide that structure in the immediate term. Now, most of our time right now is going to be really spent on ARPA allocation, but we hope to pilot this program to see maybe there is another leader, maybe this turns into a formalized group, to sort of be that holding ground of all of the knowledge and all of the work. That alliance would be open to anyone in the community, and we would, love folks to attend or not, or participate or not. So
Thank you. Any other questions for Sadie? Sadie, I have a question, and I'm not sure that this is the right venue exactly, but this is what you presented long-term, I would say. And I know that there's a number of needs that come up to a number of people in this group in terms of short-term needs. Is there any recommendation you can make when families approach others or individuals approach others in this group, like, you should contact so-and-so, or for immediate housing
like immediate
needs?
help?
Yes.
So for that, I would probably, and I don't really know who the best person, it would probably depend on what their needs were. There's existing housing providers in the area, such as Pillars and organizations such as that. The Housing Authority would be a great opportunity. We have the Outagamie, the Appleton Housing Authority. So I would probably point them to them if those are like crisis situations or needs such as those.
Yeah, just from my perspective, it comes up quite a bit, that a
Right.
number of us are scrambling to help those in need, and it's really immediate. And I know a lot of our resources are full, and so just want to have help in identifying county resources. Is that something we can probably find or share that contact information, some of those folks that you just mentioned? Okay.
Yeah, yep, they would have their websites available. You could take a look at our housing task force. There's a handful of nonprofits there. But yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions for Sadie? And just to reiterate, Sadie, if people are interested in finding out more about how they can serve on the task force, they should just contact you, correct?
Yep, we're not going to be rolling out any Housing Alliance meetings in the near term. It'll probably be fall, spring. But if they're interested in learning more, absolutely reach out to me. And I'll sort of keep a running list of names of folks who have more interest.
Which I was going to ask you this earlier too, just an overall timeline. I saw something, I mean, I know what we're looking at for the housing shortage crisis, but was there an overall timeline with this plan or anything?
No, not necessarily. Many of these strategies, if they're not implemented, they'll probably stand the test of time, at least for the long haul. Many of them could be implemented and, be complete in the next 2 years. A lot of them are programs. So as long as there's a need, there would be a need for that program. Now, the data is a different story. That'll eventually get outdated. We'll learn new things. Needs will fluctuate. But really the strategies can be implemented at any time. We're really looking at like a 10-year, which is when we might want to relook at the strategy, reevaluate, what we identified. Our strategy includes a number of metrics. So if an action was implemented and it wasn't useful in terms of we weren't seeing the results we wanted to, we would recommend pivot, try something new. Not all of the actions might, some of the actions might not be implemented. Some of them might be implemented by Outagamie County. Others are likely, the best organization might not be Outagamie County. So really it's just meant to be a decision-making tool to use as long as it feels relevant to that group.
Okay. And then from your end, Sadie, does the county plan on doing quarterly updates or, kind of moving forward?
Yeah, moving forward, we'll be looking at probably those Housing Alliance meetings. I would say in terms of looking at the data again, counties as well as cities and villages, they're all required to update the housing element of their comprehensive plan. So all that data would be, updated, relooked at again, where we could see where our region is sitting. Are we still seeing the same trends in terms of unit composition, population growth, things of that nature?
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Sadie? And thank you, Brianna, for putting that in the chat. That's helpful. Well, I think we're good. We appreciate you taking the time, Sadie, to share all of that information with us. Again, I think, and we'll also put in the meeting notes that we send out your information too. So we appreciate you and spearheading this effort and keeping us informed, and want to invite you back anytime if there's updates. So just always have an open door. We appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadie. And if this presentation, I know we recorded it, but if that's something somebody wanted to look at their own pace, please feel welcome to send me your presentation, and we'll include that when we get out the details for people to take a look.
Thank you, everyone. We'll stick around online if anyone has additional questions. Otherwise, we are early, or I guess we're early. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you again, Sadie. Are you good on your end? And we'll get your presentation. I think you're on mute. I know, never fails.
Yeah, I'm good on my end.
Okay, thank you again for making the
Thank
time
you.
for us today. We appreciate
Absolutely.
it. Take care. Bye-bye.